146 Logical Fallacies. 1. Accident. An exception to a generalization is ignored. 2. Ad hominem. Attacking the arguer instead of the argument. 3. Affirmative conclusion from a negative premise, elicit negative. A categorical syllogism has a positive conclusion, but at least one negative premise. 4. Affirming a disjunct. Concluding that one disjunct of a logical disjunction must be false because the other disjunct is true. A or B. A. Therefore not B. 5. Affirming the consequent. The antecedent in an indicative conditional is claimed to be true because the consequent is true. If A, then B. B. Therefore A. 6. Ambiguous middle term. Using a middle term with multiple meanings. 7. Appeal to accomplishment. An assertion is deemed true or false based on the accomplishments of the proposer. This may often also have elements of appeal to emotion. 8. Appeal to authority, argument from authority. Argumentum ad verecundiam. An assertion is deemed true because of the position or authority of the person asserting it. 9. Appeal to consequences, argumentum ad consequentiam. The conclusion is supported by a premise that asserts positive or negative consequences from some course of action in an attempt to distract from the initial discussion. 10. Appeal to emotion. Manipulating the emotions of the listener rather than using valid reasoning to obtain common agreement. 11. Appeal to fear. Generating distress, anxiety, cynicism, or prejudice towards the opponent in an argument. 12. Appeal to flattery. Using excessive or insincere praise to obtain common agreement. 13. Appeal to motive. Dismissing an idea by questioning the motives of its proposer. 14. Appeal to nature. Judgment is based solely on whether the subject of judgment is natural or unnatural. 15. Appeal to novelty, argumentum novitatis, argumentum ad antiquitatis. A proposal is claimed to be superior or better solely because it is new or modern. Opposite of appeal to tradition. 16. Appeal to pity, argumentum ad misericordiam. Generating feelings of sympathy or mercy in the listener to obtain common agreement. 17. Appeal to poverty, argumentum ad lazarum. Supporting a conclusion because the arguer is poor, or refuting because the arguer is wealthy. Opposite of appeal to wealth. 18. Appeal to probability. A statement that takes something for granted because it would probably be the case, or might be the case. 19. Appeal to ridicule, reductio ad absurdum, reductio ad ridiculum. Stating that the opponent's position would lead to an absurdity or contradiction. 20. Appeal to spite. Generating bitterness or hostility in the listener toward an opponent in an argument. 21. Appeal to the stone, argumentum ad lapidem. Dismissing a claim as absurd without demonstrating proof for its absurdity. 22. Appeal to tradition, argumentum ad antiquitatem. A conclusion supported solely because it has long been held to be true. 23. Appeal to wealth, argumentum ad crumenam. Supporting a conclusion because the arguer is wealthy, or refuting because the arguer is poor. Sometimes taken together with the appeal to poverty as a general appeal to the arguer's financial situation. 24. Argument from fallacy, also known as the fallacy. The assumption that, if an argument is fallacious, then the conclusion is false. 25. Argument from ignorance, appeal to ignorance. Argumentum ad ignorantiam. Assuming that a claim is true because it has not been or cannot be proven false. Or vice versa. 26. Argument from incredulity, appeal to common sense. I cannot imagine how this could be true. Therefore, it must be false. 27. Argument from repetition, argumentum ad nauseam. Argumentum ad infinitum. Repeating an argument until nobody cares to discuss it anymore. Sometimes confused with proof by assertion. 28. Argument from silence, argumentum ex silentio. Assuming that a claim is true based on the absence of textual or spoken evidence from an authoritative source. Or vice versa. 29. Argument to moderation, false compromise, middle ground, fallacy of the mean, argumentum ad temperantium. Assuming that a compromise between two positions is always correct. 30. Argumentum ad baculum, appeal to the stick, appeal to force, appeal to threat. An argument made through coercion or threats of force to support position. 31. Argumentum ad populum, appeal to widespread belief, bandwagon argument, appeal to the majority, appeal to the people. A proposition is claimed to be true or good solely because a majority or many people believe it to be so. 32. Association fallacy, guilt by association and honor by association. Arguing that because two things share, or are implied to share, some property, they are the same. 33. Baconian fallacy. Using pieces of historical evidence without the aid of specific methods, hypotheses, or theories in an attempt to make a general truth about the past. Commits historians to the pursuit of an impossible object by an impracticable method. 34. Base rate fallacy. Making a probability judgment based on conditional probabilities, without taking into account the effect of prior probabilities. 35. Begging the question, petitio principia. Using the conclusion of the argument in support of itself in a premise, for example saying that smoking cigarettes is deadly because cigarettes can kill you. Something that kills is deadly. 36. Bulverism, psychogenetic fallacy. Inferring why an argument is being used, associating it to some psychological reason, then assuming it is invalid as a result. The assumption that if the origin of an idea comes from a biased mind, then the idea itself must also be a falsehood. 37. Cherry-picking, suppressed evidence, incomplete evidence. Using individual cases or data that confirm a particular position, while ignoring related cases or data that may contradict that position. 38. Chronological snobbery. A thesis is deemed incorrect because it was commonly held when something else, known to be false, was also commonly held. 39. Circular reasoning, circulus in demonstrando. The reasoner begins with what he or she is trying to end up with, for example all bachelors are unmarried males. 40. Circumstantial ad hominem. Stating that the arguer's personal situation or perceived benefit from advancing a conclusion means that their conclusion is wrong. 41. Conjunction fallacy. The assumption that an outcome simultaneously satisfying multiple conditions is more probable than an outcome satisfying a single one of them. 42. Continuum fallacy, fallacy of the beard. Line drawing fallacy. Sorites fallacy. Fallacy of the heap. Bald man fallacy. Decision point fallacy. improperly rejecting a claim for being imprecise. 43. Correlative-based fallacies. 44. Courtier's reply. A criticism is dismissed by claiming that the critic lacks sufficient knowledge, credentials, or training to credibly comment on the subject matter. 45. Cum hoc ergo propter hoc, Latin for with this, therefore because of this. Correlation implies causation. Faulty cause-effect. Coincidental correlation. Correlation without causation. A faulty assumption that, because there is a correlation between two variables, one caused the other. 46. Definist fallacy. Defining a term used in an argument in a biased manner, for example, using loaded terms. The person making the argument expects that the listener will accept the provided definition, making the argument difficult to refute. 47. Definitional retreat. Changing the meaning of a word when an objection is raised. 48. Denying the antecedent. The consequent in an indicative conditional is claimed to be false because the antecedent is false. If A, then B. Not A, therefore not B. 49. Divine fallacy, argument from incredulity. Arguing that, because something is so incredible or amazing, it must be the result of superior, divine, alien or paranormal agency. 50. Double counting. Counting events or occurrences more than once in probabilistic reasoning, which leads to the sum of the probabilities of all cases exceeding unity. 51. Ecological fallacy. Inferring about the nature of an entity based solely upon aggregate statistics collected for the group to which that entity belongs. 52. Equivocation. Using a term with more than one meaning in a statement without specifying which meaning is intended. 53. Etymological fallacy. Assuming that the original or historical meaning of a word or phrase is necessarily similar to its actual present-day usage. 54. Existential fallacy. An argument that has a universal premise and a particular conclusion. 55. Fallacy of accent. Changing the meaning of a statement by not specifying on which word emphasis falls. 56. Fallacy of composition. Assuming that something true of part of a whole must also be true of the whole. 57. Fallacy of division. Assuming that something true of a composite thing must also be true of all or some of its parts. 58. Fallacy of exclusive premises. A categorical syllogism that is invalid because both of its premises are negative. 59. Fallacy of four terms, quatenio terminorum. A categorical syllogism that has four terms. 60. Fallacy of many questions, complex question. Fallacy of presuppositions, loaded question. Plurium interrogationum. Someone asks a question that presupposes something that has not been proven or accepted by all the people involved. This fallacy is often used rhetorically so that the question limits direct replies to those that serve the questioner's agenda. 61. Fallacy of quoting out of context, contextotomy, contextomy. Quotation mining. Selective excerpting of words from their original context to distort the intended meaning. 62. Fallacy of relative privation, also known as appeal to worse problems, or not as bad as. Dismissing an argument or complaint due to what are perceived to be more important problems. First world problems are a subset of this fallacy. 63. Fallacy of the single cause, causal oversimplification. It is assumed that there is one simple cause of an outcome when in reality it may have been caused by a number of only jointly sufficient causes. 64. Fallacy of the undistributed middle. The middle term in a categorical syllogism is not distributed. 65. False analogy. An argument by analogy in which the analogy is poorly suited. 66. False attribution. Appealing to an irrelevant, unqualified, unidentified, biased or fabricated source in support of an argument. 67. False authority, single authority. Using an expert of dubious credentials or using only one opinion to promote a product or idea. Related to the appeal to authority. 68. False dilemma, false dichotomy. Fallacy of bifurcation. Black or white fallacy. Two alternative statements are given as the only possible options when, in reality, there are more. 69. False equivalence. Describing two or more statements as virtually equal when they are not. 70. Faulty generalization. Reaching a conclusion from weak premises. 71. Feedback fallacy. Believing in the objectivity of an evaluation to be used as the basis for improvement without verifying that the source of the evaluation is a disinterested party. 72. Furtive fallacy. Outcomes are asserted to have been caused by the malfeasance of decision makers. 73. Gambler's fallacy. The incorrect belief that separate, independent events can affect the likelihood of another random event. If a fair coin lands on heads times in a row, the belief that it is due to the number of times it had previously landed on tails is incorrect. 74. Genetic fallacy. A conclusion is suggested based solely on something or someone's origin rather than its current meaning or context. 75. Hasty generalization, fallacy of insufficient statistics, fallacy of insufficient sample, fallacy of the lonely fact, hasty induction, secundum quid, converse accident, jumping to conclusions. Basing a broad conclusion on a small or unrepresentative sample. 76. Historian's fallacy. Assuming that decision-makers of the past had identical information as those subsequently analyzing the decision. This should not to be confused with presentism, in which present-day ideas and perspectives are anachronistically projected into the past. 77. Historical fallacy. A set of considerations is thought to hold good only because a completed process is read into the content of the process which conditions this completed result. 78. Homunculus fallacy. Using a middleman for explanation. This sometimes leads to regressive middlemen. It explains a concept in terms of the concept itself without explaining its real nature. For example, explaining thought as something produced by a little thinker. A homunculus inside the head simply identifies an intermediary actor and does not explain the product or process of thinking. 79. If by whiskey. An argument that supports both sides of an issue by using terms that are emotionally sensitive and ambiguous. 80. Ignoratio elenchi. Irrelevant conclusion, missing the point. An argument that may in itself be valid, but does not address the issue in question. 81. Ignoring a common cause. 82. Illicit major. A categorical syllogism that is invalid because its major term is not distributed in the major premise but distributed in the conclusion. 83. Illicit minor. A categorical syllogism that is invalid because its minor term is not distributed in the minor premise but distributed in the conclusion. 84. I'm entitled to my opinion. A person discredits any opposition by claiming that they are entitled to their opinion. 85. Incomplete comparison. Insufficient information is provided to make a complete comparison. 86. Inconsistent comparison. Different methods of comparison are used, leaving a false impression of the whole comparison. 87. Inductive fallacy. A more general name to some fallacies, such as hasty generalization. It happens when a conclusion is made of premises that lightly support it. 88. Inflation of conflict. Arguing that, if experts in a field of knowledge disagree on a certain point within that field, no conclusion can be reached, or that the legitimacy of that field of knowledge is questionable. 89. Intentionality fallacy. The insistence that the ultimate meaning of an expression must be consistent with the intention of the person from whom the communication originated. For example, a work of fiction that is widely received as a blatant allegory must necessarily not be regarded as such if the author intended it not to be so. 90. Inverse gambler's fallacy. 91. Abstergsit, bare assertion fallacy. A claim that is presented as true without support, as self-evidently true, or as dogmatically true. This fallacy relies on the implied expertise of the speaker or on an unstated truism. 92. Ought fallacy. Statements about what is, on the basis of claims about what ought to be. 93. Judgmental language. Using insulting or pejorative language in an argument. 94. Kafka trapping. A sophistical and unfalsifiable form of argument that attempts to overcome an opponent by inducing a sense of guilt and using the opponent's denial of guilt as further evidence of guilt. 95. Kettle logic. Using multiple, jointly inconsistent arguments to defend a position dubious. Discuss. 96. Loaded label. While not inherently fallacious, use of evocative terms to support a conclusion is a type of begging the question fallacy. When fallaciously used, the term's connotations are relied on to sway the argument towards a particular conclusion. For example, an organic foods advertisement that says organic foods are safe and healthy foods grown without any pesticides, herbicides, or other unhealthy additives. Use of the term unhealthy additives is used as support for the idea that the product is safe. 97. Ludic fallacy. Failing to take into account that non-regulated random occurrences unknowns can affect the probability of an event taking place. 98. Lump of labor fallacy. The misconception that there is a fixed amount of work to be done within an economy, which can be distributed to create more or fewer jobs. 99. Magical thinking. Fallacious attribution of causal relationships between actions and events. In anthropology, it refers primarily to cultural beliefs that ritual, prayer, sacrifice, and taboos will produce specific supernatural consequences. In psychology, it refers to an irrational belief that thoughts by themselves can affect the world or that thinking something corresponds with doing it. 100. Masked man fallacy, illicit substitution of identicals. The substitution of identical designators in a true statement can lead to a false one. 101. McNamara fallacy, quantitative fallacy. Making an argument using only quantitative observations, measurements, statistical or numerical values, and discounting subjective information that focuses on quality, traits, features, or relationships. 102. Mind projection fallacy. assuming that a statement about an object describes an inherent property of the object, rather than a personal perception. 103. Misleading vividness involves describing an occurrence in vivid detail, even if it is an exceptional occurrence, to convince someone that it is a problem. This also relies on the appeal to emotion fallacy. 104. Modal fallacy, confusing necessity with sufficiency. A condition X is necessary for Y if X is required for even the possibility of Y. X doesn't bring about Y by itself. But if there is no X, there will be no Y. For example, oxygen is necessary for fire. But one cannot assume that everywhere there is oxygen, there is fire. A condition X is sufficient for Y if X, by itself, is enough to bring about Y. For example, riding the bus is a sufficient mode of transportation to get to work. But there are other modes of transportation: car, taxi, bicycle, walking, that can be used. 105. Modal scope fallacy. A degree of unwarranted necessity is placed in the conclusion. 106. Moralistic fallacy. Inferring factual conclusions from evaluative premises in violation of fact value distinction, for example, inferring is from ought. Moralistic fallacy is the inverse of naturalistic fallacy. 107. Moralistic fallacy. Inferring factual conclusions from evaluative premises, in violation of fact value distinction. For example, making statements about what is, on the basis of claims about what ought to be. This is the inverse of the naturalistic fallacy. 108. Motte-and-Bailey fallacy. Conflating two positions with similar properties, one modest and easy to defend, the Motte, and one more controversial, the Bailey. The arguer first states the controversial position, but when challenged, states that they are advancing the modest position. 109. Moving the goalposts, raising the bar. Argument in which evidence presented in response to a specific claim is dismissed and some other, often greater, evidence is demanded. 110. Naturalistic fallacy. Inferring evaluative conclusions from purely factual premises in violation of fact-value distinction. Naturalistic fallacy, sometimes confused with appeal to nature, is the inverse of moralistic fallacy. 111. Naturalistic fallacy, anti-naturalistic fallacy. Inferring an impossibility to infer any instance of ought from as from the general invalidity of as ought fallacy, mentioned above. Naturalistic fallacy is a type of argument from fallacy. 112. Negative conclusion from affirmative premises, illicit affirmative. A categorical syllogism has a negative conclusion but affirmative premises. 113. Nirvana fallacy, perfect solution fallacy. Solutions to problems are rejected because they are not perfect. 114. No true Scotsman makes a generalization true by changing the generalization to exclude a counterexample. 115. Nitpicking, suppressed evidence, incomplete evidence. Using individual cases or data that falsifies a particular position, while ignoring related cases or data that may support. Named in contrast to cherry-picking. 116. Overwhelming exception. An accurate generalization that comes with qualifications that eliminates so many cases that what remains is much less impressive than the initial statement might have led one to assume. 117. Persuasive definition. Purporting to use the true, or commonly accepted meaning of a term while, in reality, using an uncommon or altered definition. 118. Poisoning the well? A subtype of ad hominem presenting adverse information about a target person with the intention of discrediting everything that the target person says. 119. Pooh-pooh? Stating that an opponent's argument is unworthy of consideration. 120. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, Latin for after this, therefore because of this. Temporal sequence implies causation. X happened, then Y happened. Therefore X caused Y. 121. Proof by assertion? A proposition is repeatedly restated regardless of contradiction. Sometimes confused with argument from repetition, argumentum ad infinitum, argumentum ad nauseam. 122. Prosecutor's fallacy? A low probability of false matches does not mean a low probability of some false match being found. 123. Proving too much? An argument that results in an overly generalized conclusion, for example arguing that drinking alcohol is bad because in some instances it has led to spousal or child abuse. 124. Psychologist's fallacy? An observer presupposes the objectivity of their own perspective when analyzing a behavioral event. 125. Questionable cause is a general type of error with many variants. Its primary basis is the confusion of association with causation, either by inappropriately deducing, or rejecting, causation or a broader failure to properly investigate the cause of an observed effect. 126. Red herring fallacy, one of the main subtypes of fallacies of relevance, is an error in logic where a proposition is, or is intended to be, misleading in order to make irrelevant or false inferences. In the general case, any logical inference based on fake arguments, intended to replace the lack of real arguments or to replace implicitly the subject of the discussion. 127. Red herring? Introducing a second argument in response to the first argument that is irrelevant and draws attention away from the original topic, for example saying if you want to complain about the dishes I leave in the sink, what about the dirty clothes you leave in the bathroom? See also irrelevant conclusion. 128. Referential fallacy? Assuming that all words refer to existing things and that the meaning of words reside within the things they refer to, as opposed to words possibly referring to no real object, for example Pegasus, or that the meaning comes from how they are used, for example nobody was in the room. 129. Regression fallacy? Ascribes cause where none exists. The flaw is failing to account for natural fluctuations. It is frequently a special kind of post hoc fallacy. 130. Reification, concretism, hypostatization, or the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Treating an abstract belief or hypothetical construct as if it were a concrete, real event or physical entity, for example saying that evolution selects which traits are passed on to future generations. Evolution is not a conscious entity with agency. 131. Relevance fallacy asserted, 132. Retrospective determinism? Believing that, because an event has occurred under some circumstance, the circumstance must have made the event inevitable, for example because someone won the lottery while wearing their lucky socks, wearing those socks made winning the lottery inevitable. 133. Slippery slope, thin edge of the wedge. Camel's nose. Asserting that a proposed, relatively small, first action will inevitably lead to a chain of related events resulting in a significant and negative event and, therefore, should not be permitted. 134. Special pleading. The arguer attempts to cite something as an exemption to a generally accepted rule or principle without justifying the exemption. For example, a defendant who murdered his parents asks for leniency because he is now an orphan. 135. Straw man fallacy. Misrepresenting an opponent's argument by broadening or narrowing the scope of a premise and refuting a weaker version, for example saying you tell us that A is the right thing to do, but the real reason you want us to do A is that you would personally profit from it. 136. Suppressed correlative. A correlative is redefined so that one alternative is made impossible, for example, I'm not fat because I'm thinner than him. 137. Survivorship bias. A small number of successes of a given process are actively promoted while completely ignoring a large number of failures. 148. Texas sharpshooter fallacy. Improperly asserting a cause to explain a cluster of data. 149. Thought-terminating cliché. A commonly used phrase, sometimes passing as folk wisdom, used to quell cognitive dissonance, conceal lack of forethought, move on to other topics, etc. But in any case, to end the debate with a cliché rather than a point. 140. Tone policing. Focusing on emotion behind, or resulting from, a message rather than the message itself as a discrediting tactic. 141. Traitorous critic fallacy, ergo deido. Thus leave. A critic's perceived affiliation is portrayed as the underlying reason for the criticism and the critic is asked to stay away from the issue altogether. Easily confused with the association fallacy, guilt by association below. 142. To quote, you too? Appeal to hypocrisy. Whataboutism. Stating that a position is false, wrong, or should be disregarded because its proponent fails to act consistently in accordance with it. 143. Two wrongs make a right. Assuming that, if one wrong is committed, another wrong will rectify it. 144. Vacuous truth. A claim that is technically true but meaningless. In the form no A and B has C, when there is no A and B. For example, claiming that no mobile phones in the room are on when there are no mobile phones in the room. 145. Wishful thinking. Arguing for a course of action by the listener according to what might be pleasing to imagine rather than according to evidence or reason. 146. Wrong direction, reverse causation. Cause and effect are reversed. The cause is said to be the effect and vice versa. The consequence of the phenomenon is claimed to be its root cause.